So we've heard a little bit about how analytics, Google Analytics or other platforms can sometimes be inaccurate. Now, analytics is a lot more accurate than it was even a few years ago, but we can still encounter some issues. It used to be that the tools themselves sometimes had accuracy issues, whereas now it's typically more human error or strategic error that causes the issues that you might encounter in terms of accurately measuring your user behavior. But regardless of whether it's human error or some glitch in the tools, there are ways that you can mitigate accuracy issues and have more accurate analytics. So today we're going to talk about the top reasons why analytics might not be strictly accurate, and then we're going to find some ways of mitigating those problems. So sometimes the tracking code is simply not implemented properly. This is not the case as often as it once was. Web developers are a lot more sophisticated in their deployment of tracking codes, but it can still sometimes happen that the tracking code is missing or pasted twice, or there are two different tracking codes and somehow they don't get pasted correctly. For instance, they end up being mixed up with each other. So typically speaking, tracking code is deployed site-wide, so it doesn't have to be placed on every single page individually. So missing tracking code is typically not a problem on most sites because, again, it's only deployed once. So the only way it could end up being a problem is if it's not deployed at all. However, sometimes brands might have parts of their site actually hosted separately under a separate domain. For instance, you sometimes see this with a blog where it's on a separate domain from the main site, and it's possible that sometimes the tracking code is not added to the secondary site, such as the user portal or the blog. Sometimes there's duplicate code, but again, Google is usually pretty good at detecting duplicate instances of the same tracking code, but sometimes you might have two different accounts and somebody installs the tracking code for both of them and mixes the two of them up. So it is still possible through human error to have a tracking code implementation issue. That's very easy to rectify. You just need to find the correct tracking code, remove any instances of incorrect tracking code and put the right tracking code in there. And if it's missing, simply add the tracking code. So if you're not pulling any data, it makes sense to check to see whether the tracking code is in fact on the site. More common is spam and bot traffic being counted as real visitors. Spam is more sophisticated than ever. Bot traffic is more sophisticated than ever, and sometimes it can look quite natural. And sometimes there are rapid increases in bot traffic that are hard for Google Analytics and some of the other analytics platforms to immediately detect and correct for, although they usually ultimately do. So sometimes if you see very strange traffic patterns, for instance, coming suddenly in large numbers from one specific geolocation where you typically don't get a lot of customers from, that could be bot traffic, or it could in fact be spam. So if you're wondering how on earth there could be spam even in your analytics, this actually happened with some of our clients. It was a really big problem a couple of years ago across millions of sites, that spam locations and spam traffic sources where the location name itself was a spam string of characters ended up in a lot of people's Google Analytics from some nefarious actors. So spam can turn up in your Google Analytics in terms of, let's say, a referral source that is a spam source, or a spam location turning up in your analytics. So you want to be careful of filtering out anything that might look like bot traffic or spam. Again, typically, eventually the analytics platforms catch up with any new particularly large instances of spam or bot traffic, but sometimes you're the first person to notice it and you will need to filter it out. A very common issue with a lot of websites is they're not filtering out internal traffic that's coming from inside the house. In other words, if you have visits coming from people who are working on uploading stuff to your website, like your own marketing team. That can end up being not filtered out as internal traffic. Now, as more and more workers work from home, you also want to make sure, because you filter out internal traffic by IP address, that you are filtering out the home IP addresses of all of your remote workers. You might also want to make sure, if they're working from coffee shops or co-working spaces or a client site, that you're filtering out those IP addresses. Now, this is where it can be a bit difficult, and you can't perfectly filter out all internal traffic, because let's say you have a remote team that goes out to your client sites and they work from there, and that's internal traffic that you definitely want to filter out. However, you don't want to filter out traffic from your own clients, because you're sending marketing messages to those clients, and you absolutely want to track their visits to your website, because that's something that will show that your marketing messages to your existing client base are working. So it can often be difficult to filter out all internal traffic by IP address, because you don't know whether some of your remote workers are going to a coffee shop, and therefore you might be seeing traffic that could be from one of your own employees working out of a Starbucks, or it could be a potential customer working out of that same Starbucks. They might even be sitting at adjacent tables. So when you filter out internal traffic, again, by IP address, you might end up either filtering out legitimate client traffic or potential client traffic, or at the same time running the risk that some of the traffic that you think is coming from prospects or the general public is actually coming from your own employees or subcontractors. There's no perfect way of doing this when you're filtering by IP address, but you need to use your best judgment and understand that sometimes you may end up tracking a little bit of internal traffic. I always say it's better to accidentally allow some internal traffic to come through your analytics and not be filtered out as internal than it is to miss traffic from your potential clients out there. So again, just beware that that is a possible source of inaccuracy. Now, other times you might have visits from one user show up as visits from multiple users. So cross-device tracking has improved considerably. It used to be that if somebody was on their phone or their tablet or their laptop, the way you see folks here in this illustration, it could be the same exact person on a phone, a laptop, or a tablet, and it would count as 3 different users. Now it's much easier for Google Analytics and the other analytics platforms to track the same user across devices by using other IDs, like whether they're logged into Google products, as most people typically are on their phone and tablet, every bit as much as they are on their laptop. But this issue is more pronounced with historical data. A few years ago, for instance, it was much harder to engage in effective cross-device tracking. So that makes historical comparisons of your web traffic right now to what it was a few years ago a little bit more challenging. Because if you're looking at your web traffic, say 5 years ago, well, 5 years ago, cross-device tracking was nowhere near as accurate as it is now. So you might have inflated numbers of traffic from a few years ago before cross-device tracking was as accurate, and the users were in fact being double or triple or even quadruple counted, depending on how many devices they use to access your site. And so it may look like your web traffic is holding steady or possibly even declining, but the reality is your web analytics this year and last year may simply be much more accurate than they were for a few years ago, especially in avoiding multiple counts of the same exact user. So if you feel that your traffic has plateaued versus a few years ago or declined, that may not be the case. What might actually be happening is that your users are using a multitude of different devices and always have been to access your site, and now it's easier to track that one user across their multiple devices, thereby making it look like you have less traffic than you did a few years ago, but in fact it's the same number of users being tracked more accurately. Now, on the flip side of this, visits from multiple users sometimes can show up as visits from a single user. One common thing we've been seeing during the lockdown, for instance, are shared family devices. So you might have a child and both parents, or several children and both parents and a grandparent, all within the same house, all working and doing school from home, and maybe not having enough devices for them all to get everything done. And so multiple users might be actually visiting your website with different needs and different personas, but they're doing it from the exact same device, possibly even logged into the same browser as the same user. A child, for instance, using the web as their parent, logged into Google Chrome, for instance, with their parent's Google ID, and a grandparent doing the same thing. So if you've been noticing some unusual fluctuations in the traffic on your website, for instance, what kinds of pages people are viewing, how long they're staying on the website, what forms they're filling out. If your user behavior has changed recently, you might be seeing multiple members of the same household using the same device, appearing to be the same user, but in fact you have several different users. So if you find the same IP address is showing wildly different kinds of traffic and wildly different kinds of user behavior, it's probably more than one user. And again, you might have other reasons why people are sharing the same device. For instance, you might be working on a team project for school and one person is doing research for that project, but there's 6 people involved in the project. Same could be the case for people in a work collaboration situation. Is one person is doing web research, for instance, researching potential software platforms or potential new cars or any product that it's often a group decision within a family or within a corporation whether you're going to buy that product, and one person has been tasked for doing the research. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for instance, you're a marketing director and you task one of your interns with researching new CRM systems, new customer relationship management systems. Let's say your VP of sales also talks to the same intern and gives that intern input about what she's looking for in a CRM system from a sales perspective. Your social media manager talks to the intern and gives them feedback about what they want in a CRM as a social media manager. And you, as the marketing director, tell the intern what your criteria are for purchasing a CRM system. Well, now you have one user using one device going on the web at multiple different times, going on maybe a CRM system's website at multiple different times, but they're acting under the direction of and in collaboration with a multitude of different people with different priorities. So in fact, it's several different users acting through the actions of one user who's doing the legwork, but in fact, it's different stakeholders involved in different visits. And then finally, personal assistants and virtual assistants are more popular than ever. And their role is often to do research for their clients. So if someone's a virtual assistant, they may have 6 to 12 different clients in different industries. And so they may be looking for flights to Chicago with, the request from one particular client. On the other hand, another client might be asking them to research CRM software. Another might be asking them to research accounting software. And so that virtual assistant or that personal assistant who supports multiple different people might end up appearing to have a very wide range of different interests. But in fact, again, it's multiple different stakeholders, multiple different customers, all asking one person to do all of these different searches, all of these different form fill outs. And so it seems to be coming from a single user. And technically it is. It's one device and it's one human being doing all of that work, but it's on behalf of a wide range of different stakeholders who are the ultimate users of the information that's on your website. And that's how visits from multiple users can show up as visits from a single user. So the rest of the reasons why your Google Analytics or other analytics platform might be incorrect are actually related to human error, and it's on a strategic level. So one could be incorrect goal identification. So in Google Analytics and other analytics platforms, we track goals, people taking some kind of an action on the website that we consider to be important. However, how you define that action that you want users to take on the website that they might consider to be important is where the error can sometimes creep in. So for instance, let's say what you want to track is whether people who are coming to your website at the beginning of the week have a greater propensity to buy than people who come to your website over the weekend or towards the end of the week. And you decide you're going to measure propensity to buy by the number of product pages somebody views. Well, that may or may not be a good proxy for somebody's propensity to buy. It might be more accurate to say that if somebody spends a lot of time on a particular product page versus flipping quickly through a lot of different product pages, that might be the better proxy for a strong propensity to buy. So if you misidentify what kind of user behaviors you should be looking at on your website, and you use the wrong kinds of behaviors to track what your consumers are trying to do or what they intend to do, that's where you can end up having inaccurate analytics because of incorrectly measuring the wrong kinds of actions. So if you focus too much on the wrong goal, so if, for instance, you simply decide that anyone who spends more than 5 minutes on our website is ready to buy, and that turns out not to be true, you might end up doing incorrect goal identification and measuring a goal on your website that has nothing to do with the KPI, in other words, the key performance indicator that you're really trying to measure. You might also simply have poor campaign strategy. So for instance, if you're driving people to a landing page to find out when your ice cream parlor is open and making them fill out a form to get information about, and again, this is a very comic example, no one's going to do this, but something's very silly, like you won't tell people what hours your ice cream parlor is open unless they fill out a form asking to be emailed the hours. That is very poor campaign strategy, and it's never going to be a real measure of how likely people are to go into your ice cream parlor. They're more likely to just get frustrated, go away and just walk into your ice cream parlor and hoping that it is, you're not closing in 5 minutes. So if your campaign is inducing user behaviors that are not good metrics of whether they really want to engage with your brand or do business with your brand, then you could also have metrics that measure very accurately some kind of user behavior, but that user behavior is really not an indicator of what you think it might be. And that could be, again, a reason why your analytics are not accurate. They're actually measuring what you've told them to measure. It's just that that's not really the metric you should be looking at. And then finally, another user error that I often see is simply tagging challenges. So for instance, when you are doing analytics, you often need to tag web addresses with UTMs. And these are additional tags that you add to the end of a URL that will feed information into your analytics. So if you've ever clicked on a URL and you see a long chain of characters after the .com, that is a set of tags that's feeding information about the campaign, the messaging, the location of the campaign, the target audience of the campaign, and a variety of other parameters into your Google Analytics, as we talked about before. Now, those tags are things that people are able to define on their own. They're not predetermined in most analytics packages. So you can write whatever you want in those tags. And then, for instance, and this often happens, you then forget what that tag was supposed to measure because nobody wrote it down. So let's say you decide to label a campaign that targets pet owners in Chicago with campaign 1. And then you label another campaign that targets pet owners in Boston with campaign 2. Later on, you go in to measure how well your campaigns are, but maybe let's say it was an intern who did those labels or a consultant and they're gone now. And now you have 50,000 visitors coming in via campaign 1 and 20,000 visitors coming in via campaign 2, but nobody is sure anymore what was campaign 1 or what was campaign 2. So this is poor data governance and basically plain old simple poor record keeping. The other thing that I often see, which is really kind of shocking, but does happen often, is people will reuse the same tags for different campaigns. So somebody meant to label the Chicago campaign, campaign 1, which again, it should have been called Chicago, and you decide to label the Boston campaign, campaign 2 or Boston, but someone instead accidentally on your creative team or in your production team takes that one UTM tag URL and puts it with every single campaign. They just reuse it over and over again because of user error and poor data governance and poor communication, failing to label which UTMs needed to go with which creative. And so a campaign will get deployed with the entirely wrong tagging because the same tags were reused across different campaigns, and now your data is completely useless because everything's been called campaign 1, even though you have 10 different campaigns, because the same tagged URL got accidentally reused. So these are some of the reasons in my observation that people end up having incorrect data analytics. And again, these are all very common mistakes, and I've probably made several of them myself. And so what you want to do is be very, very careful. For the last couple of problems, for instance, the tagging challenges and incorrect goal identification, there are some simple solutions. So with goal identification, sometimes it's a matter of trial and error. It might seem completely logical that time on site or time on page is the best proxy for buying intent. But then with time, you will gradually find that some other behavior is actually the real proxy for buyer intent. So this incorrect goal identification is often nobody's fault. It doesn't mean that somebody wasn't thinking strategically or that they're not a really talented marketing analyst. It sometimes takes time to discover what behaviors correlate with the conversions that you're looking to measure. So sometimes it's just a matter of trial and error to get to that level of accuracy. And then in terms of campaign strategy, the more sophisticated people become within an organization about analytics, the easier it is for them to then come up with a campaign strategy where behaviors are built into the campaign that are easier to measure and then also serve as really good proxies that measure your KPIs accurately. Now, as far as the tagging challenges go, it's a matter of training. It's a matter of good data governance, and it's a matter of organizing your tags properly. Tools such as HubSpot or Google Tag Manager do a very good job of generating UTMs and a fairly good job of organizing them, but you also need to make sure that throughout your organization, everybody who uses tagged URLs is able to understand what campaigns you have, what the names of those campaigns are, what the tags associated with them are, and then that way they'll be able to tell, hopefully at a glance, whether a UTM tagged URL is actually accurate. And also you want to maintain records. You want to maintain good spreadsheets where every campaign's tagged URLs are properly labeled. It's so easy to put the wrong link with the wrong creative. So you just want to make sure that every campaign that goes out is double or triple checked. And in these ways, you're going to be able to mitigate some of the most common reasons why analytics can be inaccurate. Again, analytics tools have come a long way and they're much more accurate than they used to be. And hopefully with the techniques that we've talked about today, you'll be able to make your analytics even more accurate in measuring